So, I've read a few books this year, and as everybody at the end of the year, or at the beginning of the new year, they like to reflect on what they did the year before. I thought it might be quite neat to go through this huge pile of books I have on the floor, don't know if it's in the camera view, and then kind of give my thoughts on each one of them. I think I have a fairly diverse set of tastes in terms of reading, and I really tried this year to focus not so much on reading for learning's sake or for the fact of actualizing my self-potential, but rather reading what I wanted to read and taking lessons from those to my everyday life. So yeah, I think without much further ado, let's get into it with my first book that I read this year, The Mysteries by Bill Watterson and John Kascht. This book released end of last year, newest book actually I think I read this year in total, and it's less of a book, it's more of it's called a fable, so to say, and I would really view it more as a poem about a little society. The reason I read this is a bit outside my normal reading habits to buy an expensive hardcover book like this, but I bought it solely because of the authors. Bill Watterson, John Kascht. John Kascht did the illustrations of this, which are these really neat, I hate to say it, they look a little AI-ish, but they're not. They're really interesting illuminations and pictures, and they're not exactly my style, but I think they're very different than what you normally see around you. But the main author, the author of the fable itself, is Bill Watterson. And Bill Watterson, you might know him by his earlier project of the Calvin and Hobbes comic strip, which ran from the mid-'80s to the early '90s. And for me, it's one of the most impactful pieces of literature I've read. I was obsessed with those as a kid, and I think the way that Watterson blends philosophy, politics, life, issues like that into one cohesive, digestible problem, and really speaks about societal issues in those is really fascinating to me. And that's why I was really excited to get this, because as you might also know, Bill Watterson hasn't done anything publicly since the '90s when he stopped with Calvin and Hobbes. He doesn't give any interviews, he doesn't really publish anything. This is the first thing coming out of his little house in, I think, Pennsylvania or Vermont or wherever forest he lives in, that he's published. And I was really excited for this, as were many others as well. And I can really tell it's a Bill Watterson product. I think that the way he approaches the poetry and fable within this really speaks out. So before I even get into what this is, and I know maybe some people aren't as interested in me gushing up to Watterson as I might be myself, but I really want to say this is a great product for someone who is really inspired by the philosophy Bill Watterson has done in his previous works. So what does he say in this? So basically, it's about these mysteries. There are these entities, these things, these concepts that aren't really defined, but they live in the forest. There's this medieval village, and they're terrified of the mysteries. They build these walls, they establish society around it. And then one day the king goes, enough is enough. I'm going to hunt down the mysteries, go capture one, maybe we can learn something from it. So they fail, eventually they capture one, and then when they look at it, they're not that scared. Turns out that they really blew what the mysteries were completely out of proportion. And so, liberated by this society evolves, it moves on, it becomes great. You see these little gestures driving in taxis and cars and planes and everything. But then suddenly, the sky grows grayer. There are these issues in society, presumably environmental. I'm not sure if that's really what Bill Watterson is tending, but there's issues, the king urges the people, it's fine, but time moved on, implying that the society didn't make it. And then the last little part of the book really got to me, and the mysteries lived happily ever after. It's a really interesting fable in a sense. It's very much almost an entire retrospective on what society in itself is moving towards. And some people point towards this message within this book as hinting towards the dangers of consumerism, the dangers of not caring for the environment, issues like that. But I think that ignores the mysteries in themselves. And I think really what Watterson tries to get at here is not a message about the destruction of society per se. I think that maybe that's warped in there a little bit. There's two key themes he touches upon here. One is really truth. I think that around whatever the mysteries are in this book, it's dominated by that perception that they're formed by the society around them, the media environment, and you see them consuming newspapers and stuff like that. It's quite quaint. The media environment, the words, the rhetoric from our leaders, we all say this to create perceptions around things around us. And I think that's a very interesting dichotomy that plays throughout this little fable, this little poem in here. I think it's really interesting to untangle in the context of mysteries. And secondly, what the messages this book really reminds me of as well is that domineering theme of some of Watterson's early comics about the significance of humans and almost the whole insignificance we have in the cosmic picture. And the last pages really play into that. But I think when you combine the two, I think something that Watterson is really trying to say is we try to distract ourselves into believing we're significant with the media around us, with the words from our leaders, the rhetoric. But in the end, all this doesn't matter. Time will move on. It's not that we can delude ourselves by creating concepts, by conquering things we don't know, by removing mysteries from our lives. It all doesn't matter in the end. We're insignificant as a planet. So, and I think that's an interesting message. It's a bit depressing. I don't really know what you get from it, was kind of my critique on this book, so to say. I really enjoyed the experience of reading it. I think that the message itself is interesting to digest, but I think it's very cyclical. It doesn't propose a solution, not that it needs to in the context of this, but it looks at almost a problem wrapped into a bottle. All I'm going to say, it's interesting. I enjoyed the mysteries. I think it's an interesting addition to the Bill Watterson catalog. I had actually resigned myself to never receiving anything again from him. And if this is the last thing we get from him, I think the last few pages of this book will be more significant than ever before. But worth a pickup. I think it's interesting. Definitely a good conversation starter, and I think it's one of the more ignored books of the modern year, so to say. But yeah, that's The Mysteries. Bill Watterson, John Kascht. Next up, Ray Bradbury's Something Wicked Comes This Way. I will admit, I'm not as familiar with Ray Bradbury's catalog. Of course, read Fahrenheit 51, a few of his other classics. But I really wanted to read this just because I knew it was a big inspiration to a lot of horror authors, and I haven't read much horror in the last few years, to be honest. But it was an interesting little read. The title is amazing. Something Wicked Comes This Way. I love when titles have this grandiose nature to them, but it fits the story so well. I think it's originally a quote from a Shakespeare play, but it really describes what happens in this story amazingly. But speaking of the story, I'm just going to quickly give a quick synopsis in case you haven't read it. So two boys are, I think, around 11 years old, Will and Jim. They're in a small American town, and then suddenly, on one fall day, a carnival pulls in on his big train, menacing, Victorian aesthetics. And it turns out this carnival is a bit more menacing than it appears. And so as the story progresses, Will and Jim see that there's this carousel in the carnival, and I believe that the carnival masters, or the people that run it, have these kind of wicked powers, so to say, and this carousel can age you up or age you down as you go around it, and this leads to some dilemmas. Jim wants to be older, leads to stuff like this. But it's a very interesting read, and I think there's two things that really stuck with me from this book, if you're interested at all in reading Something Wicked Comes This Way. First of all is the environment, the aesthetics. I really feel that glooming, dark nature of this book around me. I think I read this in June. It was sunny outside, but I felt every time I opened these pages, I felt the dark, crisp feeling of an autumn morning. I think Bradbury really does well here is illustrate that kind of setting that he's going for, that mood, the mood of the book. I think it's almost one of the best examples of mood I've seen done in horror in general. I think the other interesting theme about this is that clash between where you are in life. So there's Will and Jim, he really wants to live beyond his years, as I think a lot of us did when we were children, right? And he really seeks to go for that in any means possible. But at the end of the day, I think the book really speaks about you got to experience each stage of life when it comes at you. And I think that Will's father, Charles, who was also a big character, kind of embodies that as well, about finding inner peace with where you are in the book itself, within your life itself. So in that regard, I think it's a decent read. I wasn't as impressed with some of the more crafting of the narrative. It's a good book, don't get me wrong. It's not my favorite read, but I really enjoyed the mood. I think the theme spoke well, and it's a classic in the horror genre. You can't go wrong with Something Wicked Comes This Way, and I do recommend it for somebody to give a nice read. So yeah. So, Margaret Atwood, The Edible Woman. I'm going to start this off by prefacing, I want to say it's a bias. Perhaps it's a subconscious bias within my reading habits, but it's more of a blind spot. That's the lack of female novelists I read. I have to admit, when I was looking over my shelf at other female novelists I've read in the past year, there were not many. And I think it's kind of sad because it loses some of the perspective of reading a character, living an experience, which myself as a male reader can't really step into via my lived experience. And I thought that really stood out to me reading Margaret Atwood's The Edible Woman, just how much that perspective shift between genders impacts how a story goes. Not impacts negatively. I thought it was an amazing little read, this book. But I think that's the first thing I want to strive. And as a resolution, I don't make resolutions, but as a goal for the next year, I do want to read some more novelists by female authors and really explicitly try to, balance the gender of my reading shelf down there. Because I think it is something that I'm missing, and I'm kind of sad about that. And I would encourage others to do the same, because very often I see people even sharing their own year-end lists where it's dominated by things that are within their comfort bubble, be it the gender, be it the topics, be it whatever. And I try to step outside of it a little bit, but then again, you're going to see most of the books I read are political, philosophical, etc., etc. Anyways, to the topic, Margaret Atwood's The Edible Woman. When I bought this, I didn't realize this was her first novel. I think it wasn't her first published novel, but it was her first accepted novel. So it's very, very fresh Margaret Atwood, and it's the first one I read by her too. So interesting experience. Anyways, it follows a young lady named Marion McAlpin, set in the early 60s, 70s. She's working for an advertising agency, and then she feels kind of suffocated in her life. Consumed, you could say. The book is filled with all these little poetic examples towards being consumed, being eaten by life around you. But anyway, she feels consumed in her life. She has a boyfriend, but she doesn't really know where she's going. And then one night in her life, she finds herself being so consumed by all of it that she just breaks and runs. She takes off running. I think it's a very powerful scene. And then her boyfriend and then her best friend are running after her, trying to get to her. And eventually her boyfriend physically captures her. And then, I think not even 15 minutes later, we're in the car together, he proposes to her, trapping her even further in that life that she is. And at that point, she develops a bit of an eating disorder. I think as a way to really almost fight back, find some autonomy, maybe even literally showcasing how she's being consumed in all aspects so much that she won't consume anything else. I think it's a very interesting message. And then the remainder of the book is kind of her struggle to get over that, to move forward with her life. And in the end, she does break free of that. She breaks off the engagement. And I would love to see how the story pans out, because I think she's a very engaging character. And I think that Margaret Atwood does a few really nice things. What I think made this book really work was really getting into who Marion McAlpin is. I think it's very easy to write a story. Maybe I'll rephrase that. I think this book comes off more as almost an autobiography that the character would write herself. I feel very engrossed in her lived experience, and I think that's quite powerful. Almost so that it feels almost like Margaret Atwood had this experience herself. I don't know if she did, but she really speaks towards the relationships and struggles that Marion lives in her life very well, very authoritatively. I think it's also interesting the way she balances Marion's life where she really wants to be a boring, normal person. And I think it's a very much something that you can take away not even having read this book. How boring can you be versus, that sounds kind of a bit weird, but how boring can you be versus how much can you embrace the eccentricities of life itself. The other aspect of this novel I do want to mention, beyond Marion's flirtation with this other man, which kind of helps her discover a bit of who she is as well, is also her roommate, who I think is also a very important character in this book, Ainsley. So she is almost the opposite of who Marion is. I myself kind of relate with Marion a bit more. I'm not much of a risk taker in my life. I almost like the boring nature of life, very much like Marion sets out to achieve here. But her roommate, Ainsley, is the complete opposite. She wants to grab whatever life has for her. She goes out, and her main plot in this book, or her main theme in this book, is to get pregnant and become a single mother, which in the 60s is not a very, established thing to do. But I think it really speaks towards the different balances about where you push life to be. For me, the main theme within The Edible Woman is quite evidently consumption. It's something that Margaret Atwood makes really clear for all the metaphors I mentioned a second ago, and how when you're moving through life, the desire to have some control over where you're going is so important. It's so important for the identity of somebody, for how somebody moves through life. And I think that's why I mentioned Ainsley for a second, because she really seems to have established where she wants to be in life, where she wants to move, how she wants to move through it, where she wants to be going. Where Marion is very passive, she accepts things coming at her. It's not to say that there's anything wrong with that, but when she's dealt something where she doesn't want to accept to do it, the book really, where she doesn't want to deal with how to accept to do it, where it's really consuming her, where it's eating her, the book really is a disentanglement of how she can resist, how she can, stop the consumption and move forward with her life. Regardless, I know that wasn't the best analysis of what this book is about, but I think it brings forward a very interesting balance, a struggle, from a perspective that I will, firsthand admit is something that I've ignored a bit more within my own reading tastes. So I'm definitely on me looking to read more books like this in the future, and I definitely enjoyed this one. A good, nice read, which speaks a lot about women and also Canada, set in the 60s in Canada, which is also going to be something I may mention later on. Anyways, Edible Woman, Margaret Atwood, good book. Next up is Gore Vidal's Hollywood. It's the third or fourth book in his Empire series. So it's a series of historical fiction novels set over the course of American history, each of them in a distinct time period. This one is set in the early 19, how do you say that? From around 1915 to about 1925, right around the time the formation, at the end of the First World War, the coming of the Second World War within that piece in American history. So it follows very closely the Washington political scene. It follows Woodrow Wilson's final days within the presidency, kind of all the political challenges he was facing, as well as the rise of Warren G. Harding, the unlikely, he's not really the protagonist, but he's the unlikely person who comes off the best in this novel. So if you're a lover of Warren G. Harding, read this book. And the second setting of this book, which is kind of interspersed with the Washington, D.C. Setting, is more of the Hollywood. So it follows the early days of Hollywood as well. The whole way this is kind of connected on a narrative thread is, Al Gore kind of Gore Vidal, apologies, Freudian slip. He talks a bit about Al Gore in one of the later books I'll review. But Gore Vidal really perceives Hollywood as an extenuation of the American empire by, consuming the media around them. And he really dives into quite a bit also about how the Hollywood industry kind of is also basically a propaganda machine, for better or worse, mainly worse. And then the DC-oriented part, it's very much about the debate of how much America ought to be involved in the world around them. which speaks to the isolationist philosophy that Gore Vidal has going on, which I'll touch upon in a quick second. The other important aspect to know about this book is that it's quasi-historical. It's set in a historical time scene, but it's filled with fictional characters which live through the events of the time. And that's my biggest critique of this book. I think this book does very well in the settings where it explores real historical characters and their thoughts. As a history book, it's engaging, it's fun. It really brings life to a lot of the, the cigar rooms, the smoky chambers, some of the early scenes set in Hollywood. But what really loses me is the fact it's half perceived by real characters and half perceived by fictional characters who I don't care for whatsoever. I think Gore Vidal really struggles in, creating the fictional characters he introduces in the book. I think Carolyn Sanford is one of them, as anything but his own lens to walk into those scenes. I think it's a big miss, and I think I really just don't care about those characters. The other thing I want to mention here is that reading this work of historical fiction, you really get to see also the philosophy or the worldview of the person writing it at that time. I always believe that any account of history is inherently biased in some way. It doesn't matter where it's coming from. History is always the result of a perception of a period of time. It can't be truly factional. Even facts themselves, I find, are very based on where they are written, the context they are written in. And in this regard, like I mentioned earlier, this book is a lot nicer to Warren G. Harding than I've ever seen anything be. For me, Warren G. Harding was one of the more forgettable American presidents or presidential candidates, as he is during the time period of this book. But I think that how he just aligns a bit more of Gore Vidal's worldview that America shouldn't be an empire, despite the title of this book. And America should remain a bit more isolationist, focus on, keeping taxes low, keeping prosperity high within the American homeland, and not focus on all these foreign expeditions, these foreign things moving out there. That's his isolationist worldview. It's interesting. I do think they do Woodrow Wilson a little dirty in here. I have a soft spot for the only president to ever have gotten a PhD, but yeah. Anyways, it's okay. It's a bit long. It drags on a bit. I have no connection to the actual plot. The real plot is the historical events. It does well in explaining and taking you to the time period. And if you like books set in that Gilded Age time period, definitely worth a read, especially as it delves more into that, political interplay time between the wars. Good there, but other than that, it's a little skippable. So, yeah. I might read the rest of the series, might not. Anyways, Hollywood, Gore Vidal, that's my thoughts. So, following up on one of Gore Vidal's novels, I want to go to The Last Empire, also written by Gore Vidal. So this is not a novel, it's a collection of essays he wrote. And as a pro tip for any of you used bookstore dwellers like I am, but most used bookstores have a little section of like writings or literature. They never know what to call it properly, but basically musings of authors on their own lives and world politics. And that's where you get these excellent little, compendiums of essays they wrote over time, or their own like little biographies. There's a few others here that I'm going to go through in a second, but give that shelf a look. You can find some really hidden gems there, which really take you back into the thinking of that author. Because after having read The Last Empire, which goes more into what Gore Vidal's worldview is, I understood Hollywood a lot better and the themes and mindset he was approaching it with. And I think that applies to all of his writings. So, yeah, basically what I'm saying is if you like a writer, read some of their nonfiction work as well. Read some of their essays that they've done them. Read some of their more political pieces. Know where they are situated in the world around them. So this book, it's a collection of a bunch of essays that Gore Vidal, I'm going to get the name right this time, Gore Vidal wrote for a number of publications. Some of these essays are skippable. He does like a 10-page biography of how great Al Gore was and how he should have won the election. Fair enough. He's related to Al Gore, if you don't know. Apparently Gore Vidal, it's like a last name kind of, I don't know what it is. But he's part of that Gore dynasty. This is going a little off the rails as we are. But there's a bunch of essays in here which are completely skippable. Like that one I said about the Al Gore biography, or like one where he's reflecting on his interaction with this woman who recently died, who I had never heard of and doesn't add much. But there are a few really key landmark essays in here, which I think are very interesting readings to anybody who's interested in any form of, reflection on the American political, beast, or the foreign policy beast that America has in general. Because The Last Empire is very aptly titled. It speaks of an empire, but what it speaks of as an empire as in the negative connotation. What what Gore Vidal really views the American empire as is not a good thing. He explicitly lays this out in the essay in this book of the same title, called The Last Empire as well, that he really believes that around the turn of the Second World War, in America's victory period, it had done everything it wanted. Instead of coming back home, America never left the countries it conquered. It maintained the empire it had created for itself. And then moving from there, he really tracks through history how things like the Vietnam War, the Korean War, different conflicts that America finds itself in, the conflict against communism, are all created and creations by the American political machine to keep that, that need to obtain world dominance, that empire status alive. For him, America should never have created this empire. America should have been its own little, domestic, superstate in itself. Really an isolationist worldview on how the world should be. It's really interesting to dive into that perspective. I don't 100% agree with this. I think that a lot of the American empire building was going on a long time before the World War II moment, which he really identifies as the turning point. But I see the frustrations he has with where America's going. And he is very much a thinker that calls it out as it is. And I think even if he were alive today, he would really be almost labeled in with a lot of more of the not alt-right, but more of those right-wing conspiracy theorists, because he really speaks upon a lot of the American state's actions with that lens of a more conspiratorial thinker. And in many regards, he's been proven right. He speaks about the surveillance state that America is being created. He sympathizes with Timothy McVeigh, who's the Orlando City bomber, who nobody remembers, but Timothy McVeigh also wrote a manifesto which also criticized the American empire. And he actually became, funnily enough, best buddies with Timothy McVeigh when he was locked up and awaiting execution, which is also a very interesting essay in this book. And then Gore Vidal is also very explicit in condemning, I think he's listed over 100 different conflicts America has participated in to maintain its empire since World War II. It's a very sobering look at the world around it. And I think it's a very interesting read into what a true isolationist point of view on world policy is. Because I think that term, at least in 2016, 2018, when Trump first got elected, got very much morphed into something else. Because I don't think Trump is an isolationist. I would have liked him to be, but I don't think he is. And there's also the Lindbergh essay. He writes an essay exploring who Charles Lindbergh was, sympathizes a bit with him in a very interesting way. And I think that's definitely worth a read as well. So I would really recommend The Last Empire, or at least not all of the essays within The Last Empire, but just the longer pieces, basically, the ones where he really develops his worldview. He explains what he thinks of the world around him. Because I think they remain very apt even for today's point in time, where we really see that America has continued on an empire building status as he identifies in this book. But yeah, good book. I really enjoyed this one. Last Empire, Gore Vidal. Next up, and I've been going on for a little while. I have no idea how long this video is going to be, but I've been enjoying it. It's a step into my past. But next up, A Decent Life by Todd May, subtitle. I love when a book has a subtitle. Morality for the Rest of Us. So this is not a novel. It's a more of a popular philosophy publication focused on ethics and morality. And Todd May, professor, his whole starting point in this book is, hey, there are these ethicists, people like Singer, right, who set forward this moral code of how we ought to live. But we never live that way. Maybe, just maybe, It's too hard to comply by these standards for most people in the world. So given that, how can we live a decent life in that kind of context? It's an interesting question, because it's something that I've struggled with a lot too, because I know that morally I shouldn't eat meat, but I still like the occasional burger. Morally, I should donate more to the poor, but I don't always. I like having savings, right? Morally, I can donate most of my savings to, Africa or some other place to relieve famine and save lives, but I don't. But these are all things that make me technically a bad person. Yet, still, I think I live a decent life. It's an interesting book. The impression I had when reading this is, I don't know if you've ever had a first year, second year philosophy class, and there's like two types of professors you meet. There's the really serious person who's one of the smartest people you've ever met, probably did something in logic for their thesis, really severe, really strict, who you respect not for the way they teach, but for their thought. But there's a second type of professor too. These are the fun guys. They're entertaining lecturers, they're really funny, they get up stage, and they really will probably be one of the best professors you've had because they explain some, life-altering information in a really digestible manner. Todd May is one of the latter. He strikes me as one of the fun professors who's trying to open up the philosophy scene for other people to enjoy as well. And that's kind of what I feel like through this book. Because he goes into many, in the end, he kind of proposes, some funny, almost like rules for being decent, look people in the face more often, particularly when you're angry with them. Yeah, but that's not gonna save a dying child from a famine, I think that his real implication here is that I think he never gets over that starting proposition. Because he spends a good amount of time arguing how you can be more decent in your life, how, maybe once a week you shouldn't eat meat. It's better than doing nothing, but it's still not being good. And I think that's really where this book struggles. It's kind of, I would love to be able to live a decent life while not fulfilling the moral obligation that's expected of me. But I also believe that it's also good to acknowledge that we might be bad people, as depressing as that is. I think that a lot of human society, or society that we benefit from, at least as myself as a white man living in a Western society, is built upon being luckier, being in a better position than other people. And if I don't choose to give up those benefits, can I really be a good person? I don't think that this book builds a compelling enough, story of why being a decent person is good enough to be a moral person. That's what I say. I respect people like Singer who do make those sacrifices in their life, who give up most things so that they can help other people, fulfill or succeed. But I don't think because I don't do that, no, to put it the other way, I don't do that, and that makes me worse of a person than he is. There's no way around that. And I think that that's something that I can't really go about it. But I think it's if you do want to be comforted and cuddled by the fact that you might be a decent person, read this book. It's fine. It's okay. I didn't really like the politics and decency section. So he starts by looking a bit, at the community around you, about how you can be more decent towards others around you. Then he goes towards animals, deals with, vegetarianism and stuff like that. And then he goes to, politics and decency. He has a good 20, 30 pages of that. And mind you, this book was written during the time that Trump was president. And I think it's very cute, almost, that Todd May still thinks that the way to move forward to creating, actually decent political standards among all of us is focusing on the community around you. I don't know. It seems a bit too caught up in... It doesn't seem as realistic. I think this is more of a comfort food you eat rather than something that has a real thing behind it. But interesting book. I'd kind of recommend it. It's a decent book, I would say. That's what I would call it. I don't think I live a decent life. I mean, I think I live a decent life, but I don't think that means I live a good life. And I think that's where I have an issue with, where, anyways. Next, The Cider House Rules by John Irving. I have not read much John Irving. I really want to get into him, and I love this book. I think that the way that he approaches writing novels, the way that he approaches literature, it's amazing. I think that the way that he created the characters and the life that they live, it really feels like he's set into that environment. And what I think is even more amazing is oftentimes authors write about what they know, right? I don't think John Irving was ever an abortionist living in small town Maine, but he still managed to take you to that environment and really engross you in such a way that he does it better than a lot of people who write books about being authors who can't write books, you know? It's great. Beyond that, to give a really quick overview of what this book is. So The Cider House Rules, it focused on the life of Homer Wells. So Homer Wells is an orphan born in rural Maine, and he's brought up in that orphanage, but he never gets adopted. Instead, he remains there. And then as he becomes a teenager, he starts helping Dr. Larch, who's like the parental figure from the orphanage, who kind of leads it to become more of a figurehead for the other children there. But also he starts helping Dr. Larch, perform abortions on women who need them. It's very progressive in that way, and it kind of outlines quite well both sides of the abortion debate. Because at one point, Wells turns out that he doesn't want to perform abortions, but Larch is not accepting that. He says that he should. It'd be inhumane, be insufferable to deny that kind of care towards women. Anyways, the main point of this book is Homer eventually moves out of the orphanage. He eventually ends up at this apple orchard. I can't say that, an orphan in quick section, but an apple orchard in Maine as well, where he meets two people, including Candy, who's this woman he falls in love with, but also her husband, or her best friend, boyfriend she's dating, and they form this almost kind of like a love triangle. It's quite confusing, but they get through it. Good book. The more details, you can check it out here. I think the theme that I kind of want to bring up here to really discuss, the one thing that I was disappointed with in this novel is that Homer never goes very far. I don't think he ever leaves the state of Maine during the entirety of this novel. And to kind of give spoilers, feel free to jump ahead a few seconds if you do intend on reading this. In the end, Homer ends up going back to the orphanage and replacing Dr. Larch as the abortionist, as the carer for the children there. And what I view the central struggle of this book is kind of how to deal with the life you're given, the path you're moving on. Because Homer has several hands he's dealt, which he tries to escape, but he can never break out of that cycle. He can't escape being an orphan. He can't escape that identity. He can't escape that weird love triangle he's caught up with Candy and other people. He can't escape, the orphanage later in his life from itself. And I think that brings up a very interesting dichotomy of not destiny, so to say, but how much of life is defined by what's behind you. Because I think Homer really intends to get out there, explore the world, know things about the world, but he never ends up doing that because he gets sidetracked more with the questions of the locale. And I think it makes him quite happy. It's very much a story of how to find a path in life when life itself seems a bit more restrictive to you, so to say. It's very quaint. I really enjoyed this. It's probably the favorite novel that I read this year. Definitely want to read a few more John Irving masterpieces in the years to come. But I think what I really took from this was being able to ponder a bit who I am, where I am going in life, and how that's reflected in the circle of my existence. Will I end up back home? Will I end up doing something else? How much of my past is defining what's in front of me? How cyclical is the nature of my life in front of me? But yeah, I think it's a great book. Next up, Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis. I will also admit I never read Franz Kafka until I got this little book in my hands. And I really enjoy the way that he writes, the way that he crafts characters, the way that he inserts the absurd into his books. The Kafkaesque nature of what he does. But I really enjoyed it. And But yeah, anyways, Franz Kafka, Metamorphosis. It's a very short, quick read. I read it in like a single evening. I just blew right through it. But Metamorphosis itself is a short story about Gregor. I think he's Austrian. I'm actually not sure where it's set. Maybe I forgot. But Gregor Samsa, he wakes up one day in the first page of the book, and he turns out to be a big insect. And the rest of the little novel is exploring how he deals with his new existence. What his stresses were in his life before he became that insect. How his parents react to him being an insect. How his relationships with his family are explored on a deeper level. How he kind of uncovers a bit more about how they feel, not only about him as a person, but how he discovers how their treatment of him as an insect showcases how they feel about him as a person. It's very sad in some regards, but I think it also does a really great job of exploring relationships between people. The thing that's stuck out most to me was the relationship not between Gregor and his family, mainly because I don't have a very strenuous relationship with my family, but more about Gregor's relationship with life in general. Because I think that there is a sort of depressiveness that Gregor has been going under for a few months before his transformation into the insect. And I think that illustrates well the metaphor almost of what metamorphosis is. It's almost an exploration of how people deal with you after you've decided to give up something that they've assumed was your value in society. What Gregor feels is trapped in this job that he has, a job that he doesn't like, a job that he's not very good at, but a job that he needs to do to support his entire family. He's obligated to do that job, move forward, as much as he hates it. And I think that's really crept down on him, crushed him down. And then one day, I think either it's a vision, either it's like a really Kafkaesque little change in life, either it's a metaphor for him actually, committing suicide, or dying of starvation or something else. But I think that this book speaks, or this novel makes you really critically reflect a bit about what you're doing in life and how this contributes to your well-being as a human. How does this, path that you're going on, what you're being forced to do in everyday routine, how does that translate to your sanity, to your healthiness as a human being? And what really struck me is how Gregor at first seemed almost more liberated being that insect, as opposed to actually living his real life as a human. So, kind of sad. But I also did a little bit of reading on who Franz Kafka was, and I can really see how personal the story this was to him. I can really see this having been written at a time when his relationship with his family was something he was questioning, when he was feeling very trodden upon by his own work life as well. And as, a white-collar worker myself, I believe that's the right term, I do sometimes also feel how the meaninglessness of my work kind of pressures down on me. I'm not going to wake up as an insect any day, but I think it's a good reflection piece. And I would recommend somebody who's stuck in almost that corporate grind to take a few seconds and read this book and reflect on it, especially when you have a week or two where you're super busy, super stressed, super moving forward. Yeah, there's two other quick stories in here. I rambled on about them a little longer, but I'm going to make it a little shorter actually. The Judgment, skippable. In the Penal Colony, you can read it. It's okay. Not as good as the Metamorphosis, but I think both of them touch quite well on relationships, both with family, but also with authority and how society works around that. I'm not going to say too much more. I've talked enough about a book that's like 100 pages. So yeah. Anyways, Metamorphosis, good read, really enjoyed it. We'll probably add some Franz Kafka to the reading list in 2025. Next up, Cocksure by Mordecai Richler. I recently learned it's not Richler, it's Richler, because he was very keen to lose his Jewish identity. But anyways, that's something we can explore a little later on. But Cocksure, it's an interesting little novel. Mordecai Richler had one novel that did quite well, and I think this one was the second one which gained some utter success after that. Anyway, it's set in England in the 1960s, 70s, and it follows a Canadian man working at a newspaper which recently got taken over by the Star Maker. And the Star Maker is this like Hollywood type which has this almost like mythical powers of leeching blood from like other stars to regrow body. It's really weird. It's really weird. Anyways, all you need to know is that the main character, Mortimer, he's trying to deal with this acquisition. He doesn't really like the Star Maker, and he keeps sending his cronies to oversee him. But the bigger theme within this novel is almost the culture of the 60s. And I think what Richler does within this book is he paints a very satirical picture of where he sees society heading towards, as well as the extremes people have in how they're dealing with almost PC culture back in the 60s, which is an interesting, reflection on the time, and especially on the time we live in now. So for instance, Mortimer, there's this really obscure plot going on where people think he's Jewish, but he's not. He's definitely not Jewish, but people really think he is. And the more he denies it, the more worse he comes off. He ends up being labeled an anti-Semite by the end of it. He loses friends over his strict saying that he is not Jewish. I think he isn't Jewish, but there's almost this gaslighting going on in this novel as well, where maybe he could be. But by the midpoint, I thought that would be the change, where it turns out he actually was Jewish. But anyways, it's interesting. And then there's also a bunch of, explorations of how things like the British school system is dealing with, new sexual education for children and stuff like that. I don't know what I got from this book, to be honest. I think it was funny in some parts. It was very much almost like a fever dream of a book. There's a lot of aspects to this which seems like it's moving in a dream. I wouldn't really recommend reading it because I mean, it's interesting, but I don't think it's the most relevant nowadays. I think if you want a good satirical critique of culture right now, this holds up for the 60s, but it doesn't hold up for the 2020s. We're quite far along. But anyways, I'll talk more about Richler later. I read a few other books by him which were much better than this year. But Cocksure, it's an interesting remnant, and if you're into 60s British culture and counterculture, maybe give it a go. So, The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. This is going to be one of those rant sections of the video where I'm going to present an opinion that I think is maybe a bit controversial, but I think it's definitely valid, especially about the state of modern books to begin with. This is a nonfiction book. It's about how, you should use money, how money's perceived, all the little tips that financial gurus give you online. The reason I read this actually is because at my workplace, I work in a corporate office, they have this little corporate library going on where they put little books, and they're all these type of books. And if you know, it's like The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. Morgan Housel is a former journalist. I think books by former journalists or current journalists are worth nothing. So if you look at this is like an average chapter. The wealth you see, wealth is what you don't see. First of all, that's a complete waste of space. This chapter is like 3 pages long. This is the size of a newspaper article. I could see this being in the Financial Times as an opinion piece. This is not what a book should be. This book has like 16 or 20 of these little sections about cool little anecdotes about, the psychology of money. And apparently people loved it. Sold over 4 million copies. This is called selling out. I really believe that journalists nowadays have found this way to supplement their very low income from their employers by writing popular nonfiction nonfiction books, which seek to help people understand how the world is by supplying these fun little anecdotes about how the world is around them. These books say nothing. There's no thesis to this. This book just says, oh, money, here's some cool things about it. It doesn't forward an argument. If anything, it leeches the arguments off other people's to create its little anecdotes. It's a collection of words for people who can't be bothered to actually do the reading themselves. Anytime I see a book that's written by a journalist nowadays, I try not to pick it up because I think 90% of the time, and I'm sure there's some exceptions, it's just a terrible piece of nonfiction which doesn't add anything to my life beyond filling my mind with the illusion that I'm doing something great. And this really started, I think I have a book here. Give me a second. This really started with Malcolm Gladwell. What the Dog Saw. Back in the 90s, I think he was one of the first to do this, where he just took a bunch of essays that he had earlier written for, I think it was the Atlanticist he wrote for. Whatever, it doesn't really matter. And then threw them together in a book form, and this did super well. Mainly because journalists know how to capture people's attention for 5 minutes. That's what they do when they write like a newspaper article. They capture your attention with a quick, digestible information. That's what this book does well. But I don't need to be flashed with information between my eyes. I can just read a journal article. Why bother to buy a book like this beyond supplementing the income of some journalist? This adds nothing to me. I retain no knowledge of what was said in this book despite having read it. And it sits only there to make and establish a profile of the journalist itself. It's not there to add to the experience of being a book, of being a contribution to the work, to like the world of nonfiction literature. And I think this is getting worse day by day. At my workplace, we sometimes do these events where we have, journalists come in and talk about their books. I do sometimes write the opening remarks for our vice president or whatever when she delivers those. I haven't read a single one of the books. I just look at their little summary and I write about it. It's not worth picking up the book and reading. Half the times they say nothing, they add nothing to my life, and I think I would be really hard pressed if I went up to somebody who read this book and I asked them what was the big lesson you learned from here, if it was something that was actually unique and worth reading this book for, as opposed to just sending a different little article or little news story somewhere. I think it's a waste of time, waste of money. Glad I didn't buy this. I stole this from the shelf from our corporate library. I'll put it back because I don't really care about it to begin with. On that note, I also want to quickly mention, some people, you might realize, I'm living in Brussels. What was the big literary event in Brussels in the beginning of 2024? Oh, it was Anu Bradford and her new book, was called Digital Empires or whatever. I never read it. I would have read it if I got a free copy. Nobody gave me a free copy, but I'm not going to spend my hard-earned cash, as well as my free time, reading a book which I could have just summarized and read the summary of, and that did as good for me as reading the actual book. Maybe I'll pick it up someday when it's like €4 in like a used bookstore, but that still requires me to invest my own time to read it. So we'll see. I'm just inherently skeptical about a lot of the state of modern fiction aimed at, popular audiences about the world around us. Most of it seems to me to be a cash grab, and most of it seems to be not contributing in a meaningful way. I think there's very few books written by even academics, they do this too, to be honest, journalists, which have actually moved the needle. I know some components like Friedman and his, The World is Flat. That didn't do anything. You could summarize it in one word. It's called globalization. It just, described the trend we already knew was happening. And that guy cashing in now probably owns a nice house somewhere. I respect the hustle. I don't respect the output. Anyways. Next up, another one by Mordecai Richler, Joshua, Then and Now. I really enjoy these type of novels by Mordecai Richler, where he returns to his roots, so to say, in the Montreal Jewish community and explores a different aspect of one of his quasi-fictional characters of navigating how they moved from being poor Jewish youth into the more affluent lifestyles they have now. I say quasi-fictional because a lot of these are based on real people, and he gets into a little bit of legal trouble at some points with this. But this one is really interesting, Joshua Then and Now, because the person he's basing this off is himself. Joshua really is an autobiographical version of who Mordecai Richler is himself. Joshua in this novel is a he's a pretty reasonably successful, actually, successful author and columnist working for a bunch of different publications in Canada. And what he's dealing with in this novel is almost a bit of a midlife crisis, so to say. It's a bit of an exploration of how you deal with this little bit of success, yet still retain your sanity in a community filled with people who seek to exploit it, who seek to move beyond it. How you retain who you are in that. And also a lot of sobering reflection on how you came there in the first place. What is your past? Do you deserve where you got there? I think it's a really interesting reflection into this. So the basic plot of this book, it's very asynchronous. So we start up with Joshua, the titular Joshua, being in the hospital for having been beat up for something, and being publicly disgraced and outed for being a homosexual, which he apparently is not. Not that that's an issue, I find, but anyways, we learn that Joshua is living this life where he moved back to Canada a few years ago, and now he's living with his beautiful wife, Pauline, in Montreal. But Pauline is not well. She's been dealing with family issues. Meanwhile, Joshua, all his past is coming back forward. So when he was a struggling author at one point, he was engaging in some less than ethical practices, and these are all kind of coming forward now and impacting his life now in his current state. I think it's a really interesting exploration of middle life, I would say. I think if I read this again when I'm 40, 45, hopefully a successful person or moderately successful, I think I would relate a lot to it, but I still related a lot to it. It's a lot about the voyage of how you get to where you are in life, and then reflecting a bit on what you could have not done differently, but reflecting on that voyage and where it took you, what it tells you about who you are as a person. But I enjoyed this one. I really did. I've been meaning to get it. It's been on my bookshelf for like a few years. Really happy I got to it this year. Great experience. Good to linger on. I know I didn't introduce many themes in this one, but just going to say I like. There's a few great ones by Mordecai Richler. This I find is one of them. I'm going to round out my discussion of Mordecai Richler by doing kind of the same thing I did with Gore Vidal, and reflect a bit on a book I bought by him, which is more of a collection of essays he wrote at one point. So Home Sweet Home, my Canadian album, really corny title, I hate it. Anyways, Mordecai Richler, he's a Montreal Canadian who, in the Jewish community, but he denounces his Judaism. He's an atheist, but he left Montreal when he was 19 to go live in England, lived there for 20 years, and then headed back later in his life. But during that time, he still developed quite a personality, a persona, in Canada as like a commentator, as a columnist, as well as an author, as you see some of his previous works. This book starts off really interestingly with "Home is where you hang yourself." Some kind of double entendre there, probably. But it's him reflecting a bit on why he's coming back to Canada while having left it 20 years ago and being quite happy where he is. And I think that really impacted me because I'm Canadian, Dutch Canadian, and I also have now not been in Canada for 5 years now. I've chosen to go to Europe, live my life here, grasp the prosperity here. But I think that's a really interesting premise and hook to start up a collection of essays. And I think that's where the book suffers. It's a collection of essays. It's not really an exploration of what he views as his Canadian identity. And I think that's what I'm really disappointed in. It's set up so well, the foreword, to really explore what he views Canada as being, what place Canada has for him as an individual, especially as one who's a very belligerent Canadian in some regards. His whole, it doesn't come out as well within this collection of essays, but Mordecai Richler himself is very much a person who doesn't see Canada as much. He grew up as seeing Canada as a stop to get somewhere more important. That's why he left so early. He viewed it as Canada as just a place he was born, and he left to pursue actually, glory in London as an author. And then I will say a lot of the themes within this book are about, industry leaving towards, America, the American-Canada relations, etc., etc. But he doesn't really explore why he feels that way. And I think it's really interesting that he does choose to come back, though. Is he coming back because he begrudgingly sees his career here? He could claim he comes back because he wants, to experience Montreal as a city for, the setting for his novels. But why Montreal then? It's really interesting how he doesn't really take the time to psychoanalyze why he's making the conscious choice to become more Canadian again, despite still being quite Canadian, given, his at that time status within the Canadian culture. What is interesting, though, is a bunch of his essays in here on Canada-Quebec relationships. So a lot of the essays he wrote at this time was during the time of the 1960s and 70s when Quebec, and 80s actually, when Quebec was really entertaining the separatist movement, when the Bloc Québécois entered office, when they were having those referendums, when they were having all these negotiations with the Canadian government on how to ensure more French-Canadian representation within the continent, and also how Quebec as itself was changing to accommodate that French-Canadian perspective more. It's an interesting glimpse, partially because I was surprised at the level of access Richler has to a lot of people. He mentioned several times, talking with Pierre Trudeau about these issues, or meeting with other opposition leaders. It's very much, it feels like he's writing these stories in the bylines of his other, day job of being sent around and talking to these people, which is a nice, interesting perspective. But at the end of the day, it's still, like I mentioned earlier, every account of history has a bias in it. And for him, I think he's very much in the Anglophone side, where he sees the plight of the French Canadians, but he knows it isn't the right solution. He's way too realist, too rationalist to really embrace the struggles of the Quebecois. I think that's a bit of the gist of it. I think this is a really interesting read if you're Canadian, especially if you're Canadian living abroad. I think if you're not Canadian and don't know these issues, you might be lost a bit, especially when he does like 3 or 4 essays and is based on like various sports teams in Montreal, which are a bit more skippable than the others. But I think the real downfall of this is it doesn't really dive into why he believes he's Canadian. He calls it home sweet home, but it doesn't seem like he's saying home sweet home. I kind of wish it was more of an exploration of who he is as a person. That would be much more interesting. I need to check if he has an autobiography. I think that would be an interesting read, although I still think he wouldn't open up as much as he should in that too. I think he's very stubborn about that. And I think I would be myself too, so yeah. Interesting book. So, John Gray, this is 2 books actually. John Gray, The Silence of Animals and Straw Dogs. I'm going to be hiding the cover of Straw Dogs for most of it. As you can see, a little raven face, that's on the body of some child. It's really weird. I don't want to endorse this kind of imagery. I only wanted this one because it goes with this one, and this one comes after this one, and this one on its own is not worth much. Spoilers for my review. Anyways, what John Gray is, he's a professor of European thought at a British university. He doesn't do much European thought, so to say. He just criticizes progress in society. So what these 2 books are, basically, they're a collection of little think pieces by him on how humanity is evolving through time. And he thinks that most people seem to believe that progress is good. Progress is something that we as humanity should be proud of. But he says no to that. He says progress in itself has not done anything good for society whatsoever. He lists, most of these books are simply just listing out examples and case studies of how progress has resulted in the human condition and the human case becoming worse and worse, especially for the masses. I think it's an interesting perspective. I don't disagree with him. I think progress is not doing much great for humanity in general, but I also think that he's being exceedingly harsh on it. I think there's one in the preface. I'll quickly find his sole thesis, because he did a nice little foreword to the paperback version of this. But outside of science, progress is simply a myth, I agree with him. I think society is not. I think a lot of us delude ourselves into thinking society is better for us than it actually is. And for us, I mean humanity, right? Issues like climate change, genocide, famine, they persist around the world, and they're obviously caused by the excesses that we live in nowadays. The issue I have with these books are twofold. First, he critiques. He doesn't offer any path forward. He offers no solution. He simply says progress is bad. But then what's the solution? Because I think that it'd be much more powerful if he were to outline why this form of progress is bad. Is all progress bad? Is it possible to move forward in society in a way that does respect, the condition of others, the condition of our planet, the condition of the animals we share the planet with? I don't know what his answer would be to that. I suspect no, but I don't think that's a very astute answer as well. So I think that's my one real issue reading these, is that it just seems to be like not an old guy, but just a man very fed up with how society is, wanting to be a bit controversial, and then just decrying everything we've done. And I think a lot of what we've done is terrible, and I think a lot of the way that progress has shaped up in humanity has not gone where it needs to be. But that doesn't mean that simply acknowledging that fact is enough. I think he says out loud a lot of things that eventually people think, but choose to ignore. So maybe that's what he views as passion is to draw light to that. But I still think that looking forward and seeing what solution comes next is better, because I think that's kind of what distinguishes him from great philosophers, so to say. A great philosopher is not simply one who identifies an issue. It's somebody who pushes forward the boundary with a solution, with a theoretical lens which provides a new way to interpret and act in the society around us. For him, it's simply critiquing the way we think. And I think criticism in itself is not the hallmark of a good academic. I also do want to note that his whole progress is a myth argument is it's not very empirical. It's very emotional. And I don't think that the way to counter his argument is to go in and say, oh, but this many people were lifted out of famine, literacy rates are so much better now. I don't think that that's also per se the way he's going with. I think he as a whole is saying that the human condition today is worse off overall. We as humans, as the symbolic, whole that we are doing worse than we were a few decades ago. Our spirit, our shared soul of humanity is being corrupted by the progress we see in front of us. I think it's interesting. I think it's nice to reflect on it. I think this book, the Silence of Animals, is kind of unnecessary. It's just basically adding more fuel to the fire that Straw Dogs had in the beginning. But I didn't think Straw Dogs was that amazing to begin with either. I'm a bit mixed on these. I think if you really want to see how bad human society is, go for it. I think that it's decent to read like that. But if you really want to move forward to progress, which he would hate, I'm realizing as I'm saying it now, I guess as I'm standing here, maybe that's his whole point of not adding a solution, because then he sees that as endorsing progress to some means. Maybe he just thinks that progress in general just needs to be denounced regardless. Perhaps there's an inevitability about it where we won't stop progressing. So he just views his role as being the one who cries wolf, so to say. But I don't know. I need to think a bit more about this, but I don't think these will occupy my mind as much as I think they should. I think they support some thoughts I have. I feel that progress is also not always good, but I'm young. I should be optimistic a bit about the future that I'm creating for myself and my children. And I think that's kind of what he misses. I think this is a very easy book to write if you're a literate 60-year-old, and I know nothing about him. So, yeah. Anyways, that's Silence of Animals, Straw Dogs, doubleheader for this one. So, the big one, Why Nations Fail. I hadn't read this one beforehand. I kind of wanted to because it was quite widely cited, and I saw a lot of people speaking to its influence it had in contemporary, political economy, as well as conversations on democracy, on growth, on economics. Anyways, Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty by Daron Acemoglu and James A. Robinson. I want to preface this by stating, I bought this before they won the Nobel Prize for Economics. If they won the Nobel Prize for Economics, I probably would have bought this a few years later on, just out of spite. So, their book, it's okay. I think a lot of economists would really enjoy it, but then again, I view economics as the lowest of wannabe sciences, so I don't put much faith in that anyways. So what they question here is they look at growth in society. They look at, why do societies, fail? Why nations fail? Why do some countries fail and others don't? So there's been a whole bunch of explanations that put out throughout history. There's geography, there's culture, there's other ones, but they say no to all of these, and they spend a few chapters kind of going through this, which is nice. But in the end, what they settle on is what really makes societies succeed is democratic, inclusive institutions. So they argue that societies who create a way to have an institution which seeks to go for the public good, for the public benefit, will be much more, will succeed. And they point towards countries like, the UK, and how those kind of inclusive institutions caused that first wave of innovation to happen, which then led to, the British system emerging. And similarly, they point to America, other case studies. I think Korea they also mention. What do I think of this book? I think the argument is interesting. I think that there is a lot to be said that democratic institutions do play a vital role in maintaining the strength, not maintaining the strength, but maintaining the status quo of a country. Like they say, it allows, them to speak for the masses as opposed to an extractive entity. I see the logic in that. I believe in that. The issue, though, is what I think they don't adequately address why democracies or democratic institutions emerge. And I think that that's where they fall into that cycle, because it's really easy to say, yeah, democracies or countries with democratic institutions, they point to China as that case study, which I'm still not sure if it fits into this theory, but they point to democracies and they say, yeah, they emerge because there's some kind of conflict which results in power shifting, and then eventually you get these democratic institutions which speak for the masses. Because then you need some kind of event to reshape how power is distributed, to get, the extractive few, the corrupt few, to give up some power to go to the masses. But that doesn't seem like a very repeatable theory. That just feels like we've gotten lucky a few times. I don't know how well of an explanation that is for the success of nations. And I also really wonder if there's not a lot of backtracking and backsliding going on. Because it's really easy to sit now in the present day or in the 2010s and say democratic institutions keep nations alive, when we've only really had democratic institutions for, maybe 50, 100 years, or dynamic democratic institutions for that reason. I think that's one bit skeptical of it. It reeks a bit of the typical thing that I critique economics with, where it seeks to really explain what kind of happened in the past, but not really look towards the future. I think this book will really struggle to explain how an emerging nation can become, a successful nation within the democratic system. And then I think there's also the argument of, I don't know if the success of a nation should only be judged on its economic output. So for instance, let's say you're a struggling country in Africa. Let's say you have a few resources, you have an extractive, system, and you can choose what you're going to do next. What these guys would argue would probably be to set up some inclusive institutions and then and that would cause you to fall under the umbrella of probably, Western hegemony. But is that really what you want to maintain the success of your society there? I don't know. Yeah, I know this probably wasn't the greatest summary. I read this in the summer, and it was quite the thick read when it was beautiful weather outside, so I kind of regret that. About the book itself, I think it could be shorter. I think this could be 300 pages. Something like this length could probably have identified their argument pretty well, and I think there's a lot of repetition going on to drive the concepts in your head. I think very much they were expecting each chapter to be used individually for classes, which I'm pretty sure they were, but as a reader, I didn't really enjoy that because I wasn't taking any classes. But yeah, I think it's a decent explanation. It has explanatory power, and people who really believe in democracies and institutions will really like this. I don't know how valuable it is, though, as a guide for future countries, because I think the real success metric, the real value of an analysis like this is not explaining why some nations succeeded, but actually looking at how you can elevate those who are currently not failing beyond the factor of having some kind of conflict or luck go into it. Not the greatest analysis. Don't hold me too critical for this one. It was a bit of a heavier read, and don't know if I would read another one by them, but it was interesting. At least against Cider, I've read it once. So yeah, Why Nations Fail. So there's one book that I read this year I don't have anymore. I left it at my parents' place. I wanted my mom to read it, so it's a bit of an endorsement. So Joseph Heller's Picture This. It's a really interesting novel. I meant to read a lot more Joseph Heller. because I really love Catch 21, Catch 22, one of my favorite novels of all time. But it didn't write many other books. Anyways, picture this. It's focused solely on this really weird historical literature journey. So it's focused on Rembrandt van Rijn, so the Dutch painter, while he's painting a painting called Aristotle Contemplating a Bust of the World, or something like that, which I think was sold recently around the time of his authorship, I think as the most expensive painting in the world. But yeah, it's a magnificent painting. But what his book does, it jumps between the struggles of Rembrandt van Rijn during the time he's painting that painting, as well as the life of Aristotle during his time in ancient Greece. I think it's a very fascinating tale. I haven't seen many books that really delve into the dynamics between two people linked through time like that. And it's really interesting how he causes both characters to pop out in the different time scenes. And I think once you go into more of a textual analysis also of what he speaks, during the Rembrandt van Rijn's time, at the height of the Dutch Empire, as well as during Aristotle's time at the height of the Greek Empire, you see a lot of parallels also emerge about, how these, empires deal with, socio-political issues, conflict, war, how it is to live there as a citizen. I think it's a really interesting glance. I wish there were more books like this, although I think there aren't many done as well as this. And I really enjoyed how it really managed to interweave two very similar historical stories into a common exploration of themes of finding yourself within your time as one of the more influential figures. It's good. I didn't prepare too much because I don't have the book. I flipped through most of these before doing these, so apologies if it's not too clear. It's a good book. Would recommend if you're into it. If you're into a form of history, if you really enjoy either the Dutch period or the Greek period, definitely check this one out. That would be my advice on that. But yeah, Joseph Heller. So, Graham Greene's A Sort of Life. This is not a novel. It's an autobiography, but it's a really weird one. It's basically Graham Greene going over the phase of his life from his childhood until around the time he published his first novel, which is I thought it was a really interesting choice of time. I don't know if he wrote more, actually. I should check that there are more compilations of this. I suspect not, actually. So this goes over Graham Greene's, early upbringing, his inspirations, his relationships with his family, and then a bit about his university years, and then his first jobs he had working in the newspaper industry, and then finally how he found success writing. What I found so Graham Greene is an author I quite enjoyed. I read a few of his works, not as many as I should have, but I really enjoy his ability to capture settings and scenes on the page. I think that really stood out to me. And for some reason, I remember one of his books vividly that I read. I forgot the title. I put it in somewhere. But it really reminded me almost of how my own father would live through life. So maybe it speaks a bit more to an older era of living through life. But I enjoyed his novel writing abilities. And even this autobiography, it's very ripe in almost not an ironic look back in life, but he has good humor, is what I would say, about how he looks back in life. It's not a funny book. There's not many jokes, but he sees how his life is silly. He remarks at it as you would expect any old British man to look back at their life as, oh, that was quaint, that was funny. I do think it's quite telling what's not in here. So after I finished this book, I did some delving on the internets. I checked out the Wikipedia page. I read a bit more about Graham Greene. Because the one thing I was wondering about is he barely mentions his personal relationships. Around the time you're in university, entering the workforce, he did mention he had a wife there. But turns out a few years after the storyline in this book abruptly cuts off, he just left his wife to go live with another woman and his children behind. So I see why he kind of removed that from the picture. But I think that would have been also a very interesting explanation. I really think that if you are somebody who's in a position to write an autobiography, and you're on, I think this was written when he was quite old already, why not just write about whatever personal feelings you have, I think I, as a reader, would have learned much more about Graham Greene as a person, the struggles he faces, the themes he explores in this book, if he writes about the points where he was at his worst. Because he writes about more embarrassing incidents when he's a child. He stole a book, he did this, he writes about how much of a drunkard he was during college. But he doesn't really talk about those really defining personal themes during his adulthood. And I think those can really speak towards understanding the context in which his most popular novels were written. And I think that's kind of a missed part, because I think that's really what I see the value of autobiographies being. I think that's, because I read a few of them this year, I didn't really realize, or autobiographical-like things. So it's the same critique I had about Mordecai Richler, where he did explore a little bit. He mentioned moving back to Canada, the themes that played, but he didn't explore why that was going on. He didn't touch upon, what was going on in his mind, but why this is happening. Same with Gore Vidal. Or actually, I think Gore Vidal did a little better, because he did really elaborate on his worldview, and I think that illuminated and led me to understand his book. Although not as good as the books by the other authors I read, I understood the themes better because the complementary piece I read explored it more. So I think that's something that I do want to take away. I think as I go through my life, as I chronicle and journal my own ventures, who knows, maybe I'll write a book of my own someday. I do see the value in just not holding back on who you are when it comes to writing something autobiographical. Truthfulness, I think, will go a lot further to explain what really the themes are in your literature and help readers connect more than just almost the cherry-picked moments that you like. And I think I say this mainly because this book focused a lot on the childhood, and I felt like this was almost, an old man reflecting back. And I think that Graham Greene himself, he gained a lot while writing this process. But then when it comes to his adult, developing life, it goes really quick. The pace picks right up and then abruptly stops right when he has a modicum of success. And I think that's quite a shame. There's a few nice quotes in here. I scribbled a few down for myself. Not going to share them with you. Maybe you'll find them some other time. But it's an interesting exploration. Would recommend it for people who are a fan of Graham Greene. I think it's an interesting read, or an interesting look back on childhood, about how that shaped you, about how the characters in there stuck with you through your life. And I think if I read a few more of Graham Greene's works, perhaps I could see a bit more of the connections he explores in those novels within his autobiography. But I still think it's a bit of a shame. I think it ended too quickly. I wanted it to be longer. I wanted it to dive more into what his life really was, about what his feelings really were, what motivated those more scandalous aspects. But yeah. Anyways, Graham Greene, A Sort of Life. I love the title though. Great title, by the way. So, for my final book, this is one I'm actually currently reading. I'm just about done it. I was actually up to like 2 a.m. last night reading it. It really picks up towards the middle end. Life Before Man by Margaret Atwood. It's interesting to compare this to The Edible Woman, because it really develops a bit more. The Edible Woman was very much focused on only the main character, McAlpin, right? But this book really balances 3 different perspectives of 3 different characters and how they navigate a situation in life. So there's the main character Elizabeth, who's married to her husband Nate or Nathaniel, and there's also Lesha, who's also within this little triangle we see here. So the way the book is set up, Elizabeth herself is quite a case, I would say. She's unhappy in her marriage with Nate. They're only together because of the children, and they both have this agreement that they see other lovers, they have other partners. And what really stands out to me is she really doesn't respect Nathaniel or Nate as a man. She really doesn't see his benefits. She sees him as a great father, but beyond that, he can't give her what she desires. He just is incapable, and perhaps it's also a bit up to her and her upbringing. She maybe it's because it explores a bit about that later on as well. Anyways, her part, she was with this other guy in an affair with this guy named Chris who committed suicide, and then this whole book is very much a dreary, depressive way of seeing how 3 people navigate this situation and the impacts it has. Nate, on the other hand, he's also unhappy. I really feel for the guy. I don't know why, but I resonated with him. Maybe because I also don't have those manly characteristics that some women want. But Nate, again, loves his children, staying in his marriage because of the children. And his depictions of Elizabeth are so sad. It's such a cold, cruel world that the man lives in. But anyways, he is falling in love with Lesha, who's a co-worker of Elizabeth's, a younger woman, and it kind of explores, all skipping perspectives each time, about how this kind of triangle moves forward. I haven't gotten to the conclusion yet, but I think the really interesting part that stands out for me in this book is kind of how it reverses a lot of the traditional gender roles you see here. I really think that Elizabeth was written, and it gets a bit more explicit about this towards the middle section of the book too, where Elizabeth really is written as a character which is typically a man in novels. And it's very interesting to see how that dynamic plays out when you have Nate being almost more of a, I don't say submissive husband, but more of like the household type, he's a stay-at-home dad in a sense. He quit his job to focus on his passions, his woodworking, whereas Elizabeth has like the high-paying job. She provides for the household, and she's also the one who's really driving to seek other partners, to go out. She's the one who's bold. It's very interesting how that role reversal plays out and how that really makes you contemplate how this is progressing in this relationship and dynamic. I'm quite enjoying it. I will say it's not a sad book. It's a somber book. I think that's the mood I would describe it. Occasionally, but I do have like these winter depressions, so to say. This is not the right book, as my girlfriend mentioned to me the other day. This is not the right book for me to be reading while going through one of those. But yeah, it's a very sad tale of a situation I would like to avoid in my life. And I think it's interesting to see how people handle it. And again, I have to take my hat off toward Margaret Atwood for her character building, because I didn't realize that was such a powerful dynamic of how she wrote. So definitely a very interesting novel. Very interesting. I think the life before man part, the title, is a bit misplaced. So Lesha is a paleontologist obsessed with fossils. All of her little sections are about, living in a world of dinosaurs and stuff like that. I don't think that's as apt of a title as it could be, but it sounds a bit more distinguishing than if you gave it a bit more of a normal title, so to say. It is interesting. It deals with a lot of midlife crises. I think what I'm learning is that I'm trying to prepare myself for when my own midlife crisis comes. When I look at some of the other ones I read, Joshua, Then and Now, they're all gathered in a pile on the floor here. I do like to contemplate a bit more on how life is going, about how I view my relationships, how I view my position in the world, how to understand the world around me. Because I think that's also one of the themes that I'm really trying to focus on when it comes to selecting the books I read. So for instance, a lot of Gore Vidal, I really enjoyed exploring how he viewed, American foreign relations, viewed this lens of isolationism, which I don't think is a great idea, but I don't think it's a bad idea either. So understanding those perspectives, I think, is something that's quite important to me. So I think as I've gone through the year, as I've read through these novels, I think I've really learned that it's not all about forcing yourself to read nonfiction. I think that was a conscious choice I made at the beginning of the year, where I think last year, a lot of novels that I read, I tried to balance out, a funner novel with something a bit more heavier, with concepts, relating to philosophy, politics, etc. But the books I gain the most from are the ones which allow me to reflect on who I am, about what my journey in life is. It's not the ones that give me some knowledge. And I think that's also what I'm going to keep in my kind of shoddy review of Why Nations Fail. It was a good book, but it's not something that really added to my experience as a human. I think that what we should be seeking to do in, our reading and our own personal lives and our writing is really exploring the condition that we have in our life now. I think that provides much more meaning to at least me as a person, and maybe it's different for other people, than understanding a bit more about, the newest, technology and technologies, the latest crises. I think that's also why I had such a big issue with that finance book that I brought up about that money book, because it doesn't add anything that resonates, that really allows me to think about my own condition. And I think that's where novels really come in. I believe that when you set out that kind of narrative journey where you focus when you craft such a piece around a theme, around exploring how a different character progresses through life, I think that gives you valuable lessons to embrace the challenges in front of you. And that's what I feel is missing when it comes to really forcing yourself to fixate on reading books like Why Nations Fail. They're good for explaining technically the world around you, but they're not good for explaining how you should find yourself in that world, how you should navigate it. It's not many times I'm going to be stuck in charge of like some African microstate and deciding the political economy direction it's heading in. But I think there will be many times where I'm stuck into dynamics where perhaps my partner and I have an unhappy day, and how do we navigate that moving forward? How do we find, a relation? How do we end something and move forward? Not saying that's the case, but I think that's something more interesting. Or for instance, Joshua Then and Now. How do we deal with, reflecting back on life and seeing where those choices have led us? Or the Cider House Rules, probably my novel of the year, book of the year. That'd be my highest recommendation, about viewing the path that life takes us on and where it goes. Even something like The Mysteries by Bill Watterson, I think provided almost more value, although it's a bit more fleeting in terms of how we view our existence here on this planet and how we view our interaction with the environment around us. I think that's the main thing I want to say when it comes to reflecting on these books that I've read. I think I've had much more of an existential journey this year than I expected to. Now, again, I'm looking at this pile of books here, so sorry if I'm not glancing at your faces on the camera. And I want to continue that for next year. I also want to continue consciously making the choice of not getting newer books. I think that the industry nowadays really encourages commercialization over rather the crafting of a good novel or a good narrative. I think I learn much more when I read a book from the 90s that I can apply to today than I can reading a book published in the last few years and I can apply right now to my life. And I think part of the beauty also is learning the themes which guide novels around, what lessons they're teaching you there, and where you can find inspiration for that in your life. But yeah, I think that's what I'm saying. If you got this far, thank you for listening. Drop your thoughts below in the comments too. I'm happy to have a wider conversation about this. Let me know what you were reading. And also, if you've read any of these books here, what you agree, disagree, my short analysis of these, and how I should do this next year. Should I continue this? Make this a little tradition? It's been quite a nice way to fill up a bit of a work day, which I didn't have much work to do. So, yeah. Anyways, thanks for listening.